I learned that homeowners associations could ruin your life long before I bought my place in Traverse City, Michigan. But I figured the horror stories were exaggerations from people who couldn't follow simple rules. That delusion lasted exactly 3 months after I moved into the Clearwater Meadows development. Right up until the morning, I found a certified letter in my mailbox informing me that snow removal before 8 in the morning was now prohibited under penalty of $250 per violation. My name is Xavier Jennings, and I'm a registered nurse who works the night shift at Munson Medical Center. I get home around 7 in the morning, exhausted from 12 hours of dealing with everything from heart attacks to broken bones. The last thing I want to do when I pull into my driveway is spend an hour digging my truck out of the snow just so I can make it to work the next evening. But apparently, the new HOA president, a woman named Brenda Sutherland, decided that the sound of snow shovels and snowblowers before 8 disturbed the peaceful morning atmosphere of our neighborhood. The letter was dated November 15th, and it outlined the new policy in excruciating detail. No snow removal equipment could be operated before 8 in the morning or after 8 in the evening. Violators would be fined, and repeat offenders could face liens on their property. The letter was signed by Brenda and countersigned by the entire HOA board, which consisted of 3 other middle-aged women who seemed to have nothing better to do than make everyone else miserable. I crumpled the letter and tossed it on my kitchen counter. It was mid-November, and we had already gotten a couple of decent snowfalls. Nothing major, maybe 3 or 4 inches at a time, but enough that I needed to clear my driveway before heading to bed. Now I was supposed to what, exactly? Leave my truck buried and hope for the best. The next morning, I tested their resolve. We had gotten about 5 inches overnight, and when I pulled into my driveway at 7, I grabbed my snow shovel from the garage and started clearing a path. I was maybe 10 minutes into it when I heard a door slam across the street. Brenda came marching over in her designer winter coat and boots that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. "Excuse me, Mr. Jennings," she said, her voice dripping with fake politeness. "I assume you received the letter about the new snow removal policy." I leaned on my shovel and looked at her. Brenda was maybe 55, with that helmet-like hairstyle that never moved and a permanent expression that suggested she smelled something unpleasant. "Yeah, I got it. I also work night shift and get home at 7. What am I supposed to do, leave my truck buried? You can remove snow after 8, she said, crossing her arms. That gives you plenty of time before you need to go to work. I work at 8:30 tonight, I said. I get home at 7 and I need to sleep. When exactly am I supposed to clear my driveway? Brenda's smile never wavered. That sounds like a personal problem, Mr. Jennings. The rules apply to everyone equally. If I allow exceptions for you, I'll have to allow them for everyone. The rules are stupid, I said flatly. Who complained about snow removal in the morning anyway? Several residents have expressed concern about the noise, Brenda said. Snow blowers in particular are very disruptive. I'm using a shovel. The policy covers all snow removal equipment, she said. I'm going to let this slide with a warning since the letter just went out, but next time, you'll receive a fine. She turned and walked back to her house before I could respond. I stood there in my driveway, snow shovel in hand, and seriously considered launching a snowball at the back of her head. Instead, I finished clearing my driveway and went inside to get some sleep. Over the next 2 weeks, I complied with the stupid rule. I would get home at 7, leave my truck in the snow-covered driveway, and set my alarm for 8 so I could clear it before trying to sleep. It was miserable. I was already exhausted from work, and now I had to stay awake an extra hour just to shovel snow. My sleep schedule was completely thrown off, and I started showing up to work irritable and foggy-headed. I tried reasoning with the HOA board at their monthly meeting in early December. I stood up during the public comment period and explained my situation. I told them about my work schedule, about how the new policy was affecting my health and safety, and about how dangerous it was for me to drive to work exhausted because I couldn't get proper sleep. Brenda listened with that same fake smile plastered on her face. When I finished, she nodded sympathetically. "I understand your concerns, Mr. Jennings, but the policy is in place for the good of the entire community. Perhaps you should consider finding a different line of work with more traditional hours." The audacity of that statement left me momentarily speechless. Find a different line of work. As if being a nurse was some kind of hobby I could just drop because it inconvenienced the HOA president. "I'm a registered nurse," I said, keeping my voice level. "I save lives. I'm not quitting my job because you don't like hearing snow shovels in the morning." "No one is asking you to quit," Brenda said, her smile finally slipping. "We're asking you to follow the rules like everyone else. If you can't manage that, perhaps this community isn't the right fit for you." I left the meeting furious. That night at work, I vented to my colleague Marcus, who lived in a normal neighborhood without an insane HOA. He listened and shook his head. "Man, you need to fight this," he said. "That's completely unreasonable." "How?" I asked. "The board has total control. Unless I can get enough votes to remove them, I'm stuck." "Start organizing," Marcus suggested. "Find other people who hate this rule and get them on your side." I spent the next week talking to my neighbors. Most of them were sympathetic, but unwilling to make waves. The few who did complain about the rule were either retired or worked from home, so they could easily wait until 8 to clear their driveways. I was the only person in the neighborhood who worked night shift, which made me a minority of one. Then the weather forecast changed everything. On December 10th, the meteorologists started tracking a major winter storm system moving across the Great Lakes. By December 12th, they were predicting that Traverse City could see anywhere from 3 to 5 feet of snow over a 48-hour period. It was the kind of storm that happened maybe once every 10 years, the kind that shut down entire cities. I watched the forecast with growing interest. The storm was supposed to hit on the evening of December 14th and continue through the morning of December 16th. I worked the night of the 14th, which meant I would be at the hospital when the snow started falling. By the time I got home on the morning of the 15th, we would probably have at least 2 feet on the ground, with another 2 feet expected before the storm ended. An idea started forming in my mind. A petty, vindictive, absolutely beautiful idea. The day before the storm, I stopped by the hardware store and bought a heavy-duty snow blower. It was expensive, but I figured it was an investment. I also picked up extra gasoline and made sure my truck had a full tank. Then I went home and waited. The storm hit right on schedule. I drove to work on the evening of December 14th under increasingly heavy snow. By midnight, visibility was near zero, and the hospital parking lot was already buried under a foot of powder. By 4 in the morning, we were getting calls about accidents on every major road in the area. By the time my shift ended at 7, the official measurement was 28 inches and still falling. The drive home took twice as long as usual. The roads were barely passable, even with 4-wheel drive. When I finally pulled into my neighborhood, I could barely see the houses through the blowing snow. My driveway was completely buried, as were all the other driveways on my street. Every car that had been parked outside was now just a vaguely car-shaped mound of white. I pulled my truck into the garage, which was already starting to drift shut, and closed the door behind me. Then I went inside, made myself a cup of coffee, and sat down to watch the clock. 8 o'clock came and went. The snow continued to fall. I could see a few of my neighbors venturing outside, trying desperately to clear their driveways. But the snow was coming down so fast that as soon as they cleared a section, it would fill back in. After about an hour, most of them gave up and went back inside. I, meanwhile, did absolutely nothing. I had no intention of removing any snow from my property. My truck was safely in the garage, and I had no plans to go anywhere for the next few days. I had stocked up on food, I had power, and I had heat. I was perfectly content to let the storm rage on, but Brenda's car was in her driveway. So was her husband's. I had seen them both parked there when I drove past earlier that morning. And unless Brenda felt like spending hours outside in blizzard conditions, those cars were going to be buried under 4 feet of snow by the time the storm ended. The storm finally stopped around 10 o'clock that night, December 15th. The official total was 47 inches, 4 feet of snow in less than 24 hours. It was the biggest snowstorm Traverse City had seen since the late 90s, and the entire region was essentially paralyzed. I slept well that night, knowing what was coming. The morning of December 16th dawned clear and brutally cold. I woke up around 9 and made myself breakfast while watching the news. Every road in the area was closed. Schools were shut down. Even the hospital had called in only essential staff and was running on a skeleton crew. The governor had declared a state of emergency and deployed the National Guard to help with snow removal. At 10 o'clock, I heard a snowblower start up somewhere down the street, then another, and another. My neighbors were finally able to start digging out. I watched from my living room window as people emerged from their houses with shovels and blowers, ready to tackle the mountains of snow. At exactly 8 o'clock on the dot, I wheeled my brand new snow blower out of the garage and fired it up. The engine roared to life, and I started clearing my driveway. The machine cut through the snow like butter, throwing it in high arcs to either side. I took my time, making neat, precise passes, clearing not just my driveway but also the sidewalk in front of my house and even the area around my mailbox. The entire time, I could see Brenda across the street, standing in her doorway watching me. Her driveway was still completely buried. Both of her cars were invisible under the snow. Her husband was outside with a shovel, making virtually no progress against the massive accumulation. When I finished my driveway, I shut off the snow blower and waved cheerfully at Brenda. She didn't wave back. About an hour later, there was a knock on my door. I knew who it would be before I even opened it. Brenda stood on my porch, her face red from either cold or anger, probably both. "Mr. Jennings, I need to speak with you about a serious matter." "What's up, Brenda?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe. "You were supposed to help with snow removal," she said. "It's a community emergency," I blinked at her. "Help with snow removal?" "I did remove my snow, exactly according to your rules, I might add. I started at 8 o'clock, not a minute earlier." "I mean, you should have helped your neighbors," she snapped. "People are trapped in their homes." "Trapped seems like a strong word," I said. "They can dig themselves out, just like I did." Brenda's jaw tightened. "This is a community, Mr. Jennings. We help each other during emergencies." "You're absolutely right," I said, nodding. "It's too bad the HOA created a rule that prevented anyone from removing snow during the actual emergency. If we had all been allowed to clear our driveways when we needed to, say at 7 in the morning yesterday, we wouldn't be in this mess." Her face went from red to purple. "That's completely different." "Is it?" I asked. Because I got home yesterday morning right when the storm was really getting going. I could have cleared my driveway then before the snow got too deep. But your rule says I can't do that, so I didn't. And now everyone's buried under 4 feet of snow. Funny how that worked out. You're being deliberately obtuse, Brenda said. I'm following the rules, I countered. Isn't that what you wanted? She opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. This is exactly the kind of attitude that makes communities fall apart. We're supposed to look out for each other. Then maybe don't create rules that make it impossible to look out for ourselves, I said. Now if you'll excuse me, I have to sleep. I work tonight. I closed the door in her face. Over the next few days, the neighborhood slowly dug itself out. The city crews eventually made it through and cleared the main roads, though side streets took longer. I went to work that night and continued my normal schedule. Meanwhile, I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Brenda had called an emergency HOA meeting to discuss the snow removal policy. The meeting was scheduled for December 20th, and I made sure to attend. The community center was packed. Apparently, a lot of people had opinions about the snow removal rule now that they had experienced its consequences firsthand. Brenda opened the meeting with a prepared statement about community responsibility and working together during emergencies. She tried to spin the massive snowstorm as a test of our neighborhood solidarity, which we had apparently failed. Some residents chose to prioritize their own convenience over helping their neighbors, she said, looking directly at me. This is not the kind of community we want to build. I raised my hand. Brenda ignored me. I raised it higher. She continued ignoring me. Finally, I just stood up. Point of order, I said loudly. Brenda's lips pressed into a thin line. Mr. Jennings, please wait until the public comment period. No, I don't think I will, I said. Because you're standing up there lying to everyone in this room. There was a collective gasp. Brenda's face went red again. Excuse me, you heard me, I said. You're lying. You created a rule that prevented people from clearing snow during the actual emergency, and now you're trying to blame residents for following that rule. The rule is about noise complaints, Brenda said. It has nothing to do with emergency situations. Then why isn't there an exception for emergencies in the rule? I asked. Why didn't you suspend the rule when you knew a major storm was coming? You had days of warning. The Weather Service was tracking that storm for almost a week. You could have sent out an email saying the 8 o'clock rule was temporarily suspended. But you didn't. Brenda sputtered. I didn't think it was necessary. I assumed people would use common sense. Common sense would be removing snow whenever it needs to be removed, I said. But your rule says we can't do that. I got home at 7 in the morning on December 15th. The storm had already dumped over 2 feet of snow and it was still coming down. I could have cleared my driveway right then, before it got worse. But I didn't, because your rule says I'll get fined $250 if I operate a snow shovel before 8 in the morning. So I followed the rule, and as a result, my neighbors got buried under 4 feet of snow. You could have helped them dig out, Brenda insisted. Why would I? I asked. I work night shift. I need to sleep during the day. You told me that was my personal problem, remember? You told me to find a different job if I couldn't follow the rules. Well, I'm following the rules. And if that means my neighbors suffer because they can't clear their driveways during an emergency, that's on you, not me. The room erupted. People started shouting, some at me, some at Brenda. One man stood up and said he had missed an important medical appointment because he couldn't get his car out. A woman said her pipes had burst because she couldn't get a plumber to reach her house through the snow. Another man said he had run out of essential medication because the roads weren't passable. Brenda tried to regain control of the meeting, but it was too late. The floodgates had opened. For the next hour, residents aired their grievances about the snow removal policy. Several people pointed out that they worked early morning shifts and couldn't clear their driveways before leaving for work. Others noted that waiting until 8 o'clock meant clearing snow in full daylight, when it was warmer, and the snow was heavier and harder to move. Finally, a man I recognized as Gerald Patterson, who lived 2 streets over, stood up. Gerald was a retired attorney, and he had a reputation for being meticulous about rules and regulations. "Madam President," he said formally, "I've been reviewing the HOA bylaws, and I don't believe the board had the authority to implement this snow removal policy in the first place." Brenda's head snapped toward him. "What are you talking about?" Gerald pulled out a sheaf of papers. According to Article 7, Section 3 of the HOA bylaws, the board cannot create rules that interfere with a homeowner's ability to maintain their property. Snow removal is a maintenance issue. By preventing homeowners from removing snow when necessary, the board is arguably violating the bylaws. "That's absurd," Brenda said. "The rule doesn't prevent snow removal, it just regulates when it can be done." "A distinction without a difference," Gerald said. "If I need to remove snow at 7 in the morning to get to work, and your rule prevents me from doing so, then you are interfering with my ability to maintain my property." Furthermore, Article 7, Section 5 requires the board to conduct a vote of the full membership before implementing any rule that could materially affect property values or quality of life. Was such a vote conducted? Brenda hesitated. "The board voted on it." "I asked about a vote of the full membership," Gerald said, "not the board." "We don't need a full membership vote for every minor rule change," Brenda said. "But you do need one for major changes," Gerald said. "And I would argue that a rule preventing essential property maintenance qualifies as major. I move that the snow removal policy be immediately suspended pending a vote of the full membership." "Seconded," I said immediately. Other voices joined in. "Seconded. Seconded. Agreed." Brenda looked around the room, clearly realizing she had lost control. "Fine," she said tersely. "We'll put it to a vote, but I want it on record that this board implemented the policy in good faith, based on legitimate complaints from residents." "What residents?" someone shouted. "Who complained?" Brenda didn't answer. The vote was scheduled for January 10th, which gave everyone time to recover from the holidays. In the meantime, the snow removal policy was temporarily suspended. I went back to clearing my driveway whenever I needed to, and life returned to something approaching normal. But I wasn't done with Brenda. Not by a long shot. During my downtime at work, I started doing research. I wanted to know exactly who had complained about snow removal noise, if anyone had actually complained at all. HOA records were supposed to be available to homeowners, so I submitted a formal request to review all communications related to the snow removal policy. Brenda tried to deny my request, claiming the communications were confidential. Gerald Patterson informed her that they weren't. After a week of back and forth, the board finally produced a file containing exactly 3 emails about snow removal noise. I read them carefully. The first was from a woman named Susan Morty, who lived on the opposite end of the neighborhood. She had complained about her neighbor running a loud snow blower at 6 in the morning. The second was from a man named Tom Richardson, who complained about people gunning their engines trying to get out of snowy driveways. The third email was from Brenda herself, complaining about the general chaos of early morning snow removal. That was it. 3 emails. 2 from residents with specific complaints about specific neighbors, and 1 from Brenda herself. Based on this, The board had implemented a blanket policy affecting the entire neighborhood. I made copies of everything and started preparing for the January meeting. The holidays came and went. Christmas was quiet. New Year's was even quieter. We got a couple more snowfalls. Nothing major, and people removed their snow whenever they felt like it without any interference from the board. It was almost like the policy had never existed. Then January 10th arrived. The community center was packed again. Everyone had received ballots in the mail, and the meeting was scheduled to count the votes and announce the results. I had spent the past few weeks talking to every neighbor I could find, explaining the situation and encouraging them to vote against the snow removal policy. I had no idea if it would be enough. Brenda called the meeting to order and immediately launched into a speech about the importance of peace and quiet in residential neighborhoods. She talked about property values and community standards and the need for reasonable regulations. She made it sound like voting to repeal the snow removal policy would turn our neighborhood into a lawless wasteland where people ran snow blowers at 3 in the morning. When she finally finished, it was time for the vote count. The board had appointed 3 neutral residents to tally the ballots. The room fell silent as they worked. After about 15 minutes, one of the counters stood up and handed a piece of paper to Brenda. She looked at it, and her face went pale. The vote is 147 in favor of repealing the policy and 32 against, she announced in a tight voice. The snow removal policy is hereby repealed. The room erupted in applause. I allowed myself a small smile, but I wasn't finished. When the noise died down, I raised my hand. Brenda saw me and visibly tensed. "Yes, Mr. Jennings. I have a question about the policy implementation," I said, standing up. Specifically, I want to know why the board implemented a major policy change without conducting a vote of the full membership, in violation of the HOA bylaws. "We've already addressed this," Brenda said. "The board has the authority to implement reasonable rules, but not rules that materially affect property values or quality of life," I said. And according to the documents I requested, the policy was based on exactly 3 emails, 2 from residents with specific complaints about specific neighbors, and 1 from you. That's hardly a groundswell of community concern. I held up the copies I had made. In fact, it looks to me like you used a couple of isolated complaints as an excuse to implement a policy that you personally wanted. And when that policy caused problems during a major snowstorm, you tried to blame residents for following it. Brenda's face was now bright red. "I don't appreciate your tone, Mr. Jennings. And I don't appreciate being told to find a new job because I couldn't follow an illegal policy," I shot back. "You violated the HOA bylaws. You created a safety hazard during an emergency, and you tried to cover it up by blaming homeowners for your mistake. I think you owe this community an apology." The room went silent. Everyone was staring at Brenda. She stood there, gripping the podium, clearly trying to decide how to respond. Finally, she said, "I was acting in what I believed were the best interests of the community." "That's not an apology," I said. "I'm not apologizing for trying to maintain standards in this neighborhood," Brenda snapped. "If people don't like the rules, they're free to move elsewhere." The room erupted again. People started shouting at Brenda, demanding her resignation. The other board members looked uncomfortable, clearly wanting to be anywhere else. Gerald Patterson stood up. "Madam President, I move for a vote of no confidence in your leadership." "Seconded," multiple voices called out. Brenda's face went from red to white. "You can't do that." "Actually, we can," Gerald said. "Article 9, Section 2 of the bylaws allows for the removal of board members by a 2/3 vote of the membership. I move that we hold such a vote right now." The vote was conducted by paper ballot to ensure privacy. It took about 30 minutes for everyone to vote and for the ballots to be counted. When the results were announced, Brenda had been removed from the board by a vote of 163 to 16. She stood there in shock for a moment, then gathered her papers and stormed out of the community center without another word. The remaining board members quickly scheduled a special election to fill her position. I went home that night feeling vindicated. The stupid snow removal policy was gone, Brenda was off the board, and the neighborhood could go back to functioning normally. I figured that was the end of it. I was wrong. 2 weeks later, on January 24th, I received a certified letter from Brenda's attorney. She was suing me for defamation, claiming that my statements at the HOA meeting had damaged her reputation and caused her emotional distress. She was seeking $50,000 in damages. I stared at the letter in disbelief. Everything I had said at the meeting was true and backed up by documents. But apparently, Brenda was so angry about being removed from the board that she was willing to file a frivolous lawsuit just to make my life difficult. I called Gerald Patterson, who had mentioned at the meeting that he still did some legal consulting. He agreed to look at the case. "This is garbage," Gerald said after reviewing the lawsuit. "You stated facts that are a matter of public record. That's not defamation. But defending yourself is going to cost money, even though you'll probably win." "How much money?" I asked. "Depends on how far she takes it," Gerald said. "Could be a few thousand in legal fees, maybe more if it goes to trial." I felt anger bubbling up inside me. Brenda was using the legal system to punish me for standing up to her. Even if I won, I would be out thousands of dollars. "Can I countersue?" I asked. Gerald smiled. "Now you're thinking like a lawyer. Yes, you can countersue for malicious prosecution. If you can prove she filed the lawsuit without merit and for the purpose of harassment, you can recover your legal fees and potentially additional damages." Over the next few weeks, I worked with Gerald to prepare my defense and countersuit. We gathered all the HOA documents, meeting minutes, and emails related to the snow removal policy. We prepared statements from neighbors who had been affected by the policy. We built a comprehensive case showing that everything I had said at the meeting was factually accurate. The case was scheduled for a preliminary hearing in March. In Michigan, defamation cases require the plaintiff to prove that the defendant made false statements. We were confident that Brenda couldn't meet that burden. The hearing took place on March 15th at the Grand Traverse County Courthouse. Brenda showed up with her attorney, a slick-looking guy in an expensive suit. I was there with Gerald, who wore a rumpled blazer and carried a battered briefcase that had probably been old when Reagan was president. Brenda's attorney went first, arguing that I had publicly humiliated his client by making inflammatory statements at the HOA meeting. He claimed that I had called her a liar and accused her of violating the bylaws without proof. Then it was our turn. Gerald stood up and methodically walked through every statement I had made at the meeting. He showed that the snow removal policy had indeed been implemented without a full membership vote, in violation of the bylaws. He showed that the policy had been based on only 3 emails, one of which was from Brenda herself. He showed that Brenda had told me to find a new job if I couldn't follow the rules. He showed that she had tried to blame residents for the consequences of her policy during the emergency board meeting. "Your Honor," Gerald said, "Mr. Jennings stated facts. He did not defame anyone. He exercised his right as a homeowner to question board decisions and to advocate for policy changes. That is not only legal, it's exactly what HOA members are supposed to do. Miss Sutherland's lawsuit is a transparent attempt to punish Mr. Jennings for speaking out against her." It's harassment, plain and simple. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia Delgado, listened carefully to both sides. Then she reviewed the documents we had submitted. After about 15 minutes, she looked up. "I'm dismissing the defamation claim," Judge Delgado said. Mr. Jennings's statements were substantially true and made in a context where he had every right to criticize HOA policies. "Miss Sutherland, if you disagreed with his characterization of events, your remedy was to respond at the meeting, not to file a lawsuit. Motion to dismiss is granted." Brenda's face went white. Her attorney started to object, but the judge cut him off. "Furthermore," Judge Delgado continued, "I'm awarding attorney's fees to Mr. Jennings. This lawsuit had no merit and it appears to have been filed for the purpose of harassment. Miss Sutherland, you will reimburse Mr. Jennings for his legal costs." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Not only had I won, but I wasn't going to be out any money. In fact, Brenda was going to have to pay my legal fees, which had already climbed to about $4,000. But Gerald wasn't done. He stood up again. "Your Honor, my client would like to pursue his countersuit for malicious prosecution." Judge Delgado nodded. "I'll allow it, but I'm going to suggest that the parties attempt mediation before we schedule a trial. Miss Sutherland, I strongly encourage you to settle this matter. If this goes to trial and you lose, the damages could be significantly higher than they would be in a settlement." We left the courthouse that day with a mediation date scheduled for April 12th. Gerald explained that mediation was basically supervised negotiation, where both sides would try to reach an agreement without going to trial. "What do you want out of this?" Gerald asked me. I thought about it. "I want my legal fees paid, which the judge already ordered. And I want Brenda to promise in writing that she'll never file another lawsuit against me or interfere with my property again." "We can ask for more," Gerald said. "Emotional distress, punitive damages." "I don't want more," I said. "I just want this to be over." The mediation took place in a conference room at a law office in downtown Traverse City. Brenda showed up looking tired and angry. We sat on opposite sides of a long table with a mediator between us. The mediator explained the process and asked each side to present their position. Gerald explained that I was seeking my legal fees, which had now grown to $4,500, plus a written agreement that Brenda would not file any further legal action against me or interfere with my property. Brenda's attorney countered that she shouldn't have to pay anything beyond the court-ordered legal fees from the defamation case. "Your client filed a frivolous lawsuit for the purpose of harassment," Gerald said. "She's lucky we're not asking for more. If we go to trial, we'll seek punitive damages. That could be tens of thousands of dollars." The mediator asked Brenda and her attorney to step out of the room for a private conversation. They were gone for about 20 minutes. When they came back, Brenda looked defeated. "We'll agree to the terms," her attorney said. "Miss Sutherland will pay the legal fees and sign the non-interference agreement." And just like that, it was over. We signed the paperwork right there in the conference room. Brenda wrote a check for $4,500 and handed it to Gerald without looking at me. Then she signed a document promising not to file any further legal action against me or interfere with my property in any way. If she violated the agreement, I could seek damages and attorney's fees in court. We left the mediation without speaking to each other. I never saw Brenda again after that. I heard from neighbors that she and her husband sold their house that summer and moved to a condo in Florida. Apparently, she couldn't stand the humiliation of being removed from the HOA board and losing the lawsuit. The neighborhood elected a new board in May, and they immediately repealed several other unpopular policies that Brenda had implemented. The new president was a middle-aged guy named Robert Chen, who worked as an accountant and had no interest in micromanaging anyone's life. Under his leadership, the HOA went back to focusing on actual community issues like road maintenance and common area upkeep, rather than nitpicking about snow removal times. Life returned to normal. I continued working night shift at the hospital, and I cleared my driveway whenever I needed to, whether that was at 7 in the morning or 7 at night. Nobody complained. Nobody sent me threatening letters. Nobody tried to fine me. The following winter, we got another big snowstorm, though nothing like the monster we had seen in December. I got home from work one morning to find about 18 inches in my driveway. I fired up my snow blower and cleared it out, then cleared my elderly neighbor's driveway too, because that's what you do in a community. You help each other. You don't create stupid rules that prevent people from helping themselves or others. I thought about Brenda sometimes, wondering if she was happy in Florida, wondering if she had found a new HOA to terrorize. But mostly, I just felt grateful that she was gone and that I could live my life without someone constantly looking for reasons to fine me or tell me I was doing something wrong. The whole experience taught me a few things. First, HOA horror stories aren't always exaggerations. Sometimes they're completely accurate. Second, standing up to unreasonable authority figures is worth it, even when it's difficult and expensive. And third, sometimes the best revenge is simply following the rules exactly as written and letting the consequences speak for themselves. I never regretted letting Brenda's cars get buried under 4 feet of snow. She created the policy that made it impossible for anyone to clear their driveways during the storm. She dismissed my concerns and told me to find a new job. She tried to blame homeowners for the consequences of her own decisions, and when she finally faced accountability for her actions, she tried to sue me into silence. But here's the thing about karma: it's patient. Brenda thought she could use her position as HOA president to control everyone in the neighborhood. She thought she could make arbitrary rules and enforce them without consequence. She thought she was untouchable. She was wrong. Looking back now, almost a year later, I can see how the whole situation could have been avoided. If Brenda had been willing to listen to reasonable concerns about the snow removal policy, if she had been willing to include exceptions for people with legitimate needs, if she had been willing to suspend the policy during a major emergency, none of this would have happened. But she wasn't interested in being reasonable. She was interested in being in control, and that's really what the whole conflict was about. It wasn't about snow or noise or property values. It was about power. Brenda wanted to feel important and powerful, and the HOA presidency gave her a platform to exercise that power over other people. When I challenged that power, when I refused to simply accept her unreasonable rules, she saw it as a personal attack. The truth is, most HOA disputes aren't really about the specific rules or policies. They're about people with too much time and too much need for control trying to impose their will on others. The rules are just an excuse, a framework for exercising power, but communities don't work that way. Communities work when people recognize that everyone has different needs and circumstances, and when they try to accommodate those differences rather than forcing everyone into the same mold. Communities work when leaders actually listen to concerns and adjust policies based on feedback. Communities work when people assume good faith in their neighbors rather than looking for violations to punish. The neighborhood of Clearwater Meadows is a better place now than it was under Brenda's leadership. The HOA still exists, and it still has rules, but they're reasonable rules that make sense. There are guidelines about maintaining your property, paying your dues, and not doing things that would negatively impact your neighbors. But there's also flexibility and understanding when people have legitimate reasons for needing exceptions. Last month, one of my neighbors had a family emergency and had to travel out of state for 2 weeks. His lawn got a bit overgrown while he was gone. Under Brenda's leadership, he would have received a violation notice and a fine. Under the new board, Robert Chen just knocked on his door when he got back and asked if everything was okay, if he needed any help getting caught up on yard work. That's the difference between a board that wants to help the community and a board that wants to control it. As for me, I'm still working night shift at Munson Medical Center. I'm still coming home at 7 in the morning. And when it snows, I'm still clearing my driveway as soon as I get home, because that's what makes sense for my schedule and my life. Nobody bothers me about it. Nobody sends me threatening letters. Nobody tells me to find a new job. I did eventually run into Susan Morty, one of the 2 neighbors who had originally complained about snow removal noise. I was curious what she thought about the whole situation. She was surprisingly apologetic. "I never meant for it to turn into this big thing," she told me. My neighbor was running his snow blower at 6 in the morning right under my bedroom window. I just asked if he could maybe wait an hour or start on a different part of his driveway. Brenda turned it into a whole policy for the entire neighborhood. That confirmed what I had suspected all along. The complaints had been specific and reasonable. It was Brenda who had taken them and used them as justification for a blanket policy that made no sense. Tom Richardson, the other complainant, told me essentially the same thing. He had complained about one neighbor who kept gunning his engine trying to get out of an icy driveway at 5:30 in the morning. "I just wanted him to maybe put some salt down or call for help instead of waking up the whole street," Tom said. I never asked for a rule banning all snow removal before 8. So even the people whose complaints formed the basis for the policy hadn't actually wanted the policy. It was entirely Brenda's creation, her attempt to impose order and control on a situation that didn't need it. I think about that sometimes when I see news stories about HOA disputes. There's always someone like Brenda in these stories, someone who takes a small issue and blows it up into a major conflict because they can't resist the urge to control other people. And there are always people who suffer because of it, people who just want to live their lives without constant interference and micromanagement. The good news is that homeowners do have rights. The bylaws matter. The voting process matters. When enough people stand up and say, "This is ridiculous," change can happen. It's not easy and it's not quick, but it's possible. If I could give advice to anyone dealing with an unreasonable HOA, it would be this. Document everything, know your rights, and don't be afraid to push back. Read your bylaws. Request documents. Ask questions at meetings. Vote in elections. Run for the board yourself if you have to. These organizations only have as much power as homeowners allow them to have. And if all else fails, follow their stupid rules to the letter and let the consequences speak for themselves. Sometimes malicious compliance is the only language that unreasonable people understand. The snow removal incident became legendary in Clearwater Meadows. For months afterward, people would joke about it. Remember when Brenda's car was buried under 4 feet of snow? Remember when Xavier just left everyone to dig themselves out? It became shorthand for the whole conflict, a reminder of what happens when rules don't make sense and leaders refuse to listen. But it also became a teaching moment for the community. The new HOA board used it as an example of how not to create policies. They implemented a new procedure requiring all major rule changes to be discussed at a community meeting before being voted on. They created an email list where residents could voice concerns and suggestions. They made the HOA more transparent and more responsive to homeowners' needs. It turns out that near disaster can sometimes lead to positive change. The December blizzard and the subsequent chaos forced the neighborhood to confront problems that had been building for years. Brenda had been implementing unpopular policies and ignoring complaints long before the snow removal fiasco. But that was the one that finally pushed people to take action. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if we had gotten a mild winter that year. If there had been no major snowstorm, would people have just accepted the 8 o'clock rule? Would Brenda still be HOA president, still making everyone's lives miserable? It's possible. Sometimes it takes a crisis to motivate people to fix broken systems. But the crisis happened, and the system got fixed. And while I wouldn't want to go through all of that again, the lawsuit and the stress and the conflict, I'm glad I stood up for what was right. I'm glad I didn't just accept an unreasonable rule because someone in authority said I had to. I'm glad I let Brenda's cars get buried under 4 feet of snow. Because sometimes, the best way to prove that a rule is stupid is to follow it exactly and let everyone see the results. And the results that December morning, when half the neighborhood was trapped in their homes because they couldn't clear their driveways during an actual emergency, spoke louder than any argument I could have made. Winter came and went. Spring arrived with its mud and rain. Summer brought tourists to Traverse City's beaches and cherry orchards. Fall painted the trees in brilliant colors. And then winter returned, as it always does in northern Michigan. But this time, when the snow fell, people cleared their driveways whenever they needed to. Early morning, late evening, middle of the night if necessary. And the neighborhood didn't descend into chaos. Property values didn't plummet. People didn't start running snow blowers at 3 in the morning just because they could. Because that's the thing about treating people like adults. Most of them will act like adults. Most people don't want to disturb their neighbors. Most people will be reasonable if you give them the chance. You don't need draconian rules and harsh penalties to maintain a functioning community. You just need a little bit of common sense and a little bit of trust. Brenda never understood that. She saw her neighbors as problems to be managed rather than people to be respected. And in the end, that's what cost her everything: her position on the board, her reputation in the community, and eventually her home in the neighborhood. As for me, I'm still here. I'm still working night shift, still saving lives at the hospital, still coming home exhausted at 7 in the morning. But now I can clear my driveway without worrying about fines or lawsuits or angry HOA presidents. I can live my life the way I need to live it, and my neighbors can do the same. And really, isn't that all anyone wants? To be left alone to live their life without unreasonable interference. To be treated with basic respect and understanding. To have the freedom to maintain their property and meet their obligations without jumping through arbitrary hoops. The whole snow removal saga taught me that these things are worth fighting for. They're worth the stress and the conflict and the legal fees. Because at the end of the day, your home should be a place where you feel safe and comfortable, not a place where you're constantly looking over your shoulder wondering if you're violating some obscure rule. I learned that some people will use any amount of power they're given to make other people's lives harder. But I also learned that those people can be stopped if enough others are willing to stand up and say no. The snow melted. Spring came again. Life went on, but the lessons remained. And every time it snows now, when I fire up my snow blower at 7 in the morning after a long night shift, I think about Brenda and smile. Because I won. Common sense won. And sometimes, that's the best ending you can ask for.